Hey, it's Lynn, and welcome back to Anatomy of a Película, my ongoing one woman, one movie at a time campaign to get more international audiences watching Filipino cinema disguised as a humble YouTube series. Today's film is Olivia Lamasan's 2014 romantic drama, Starting Over Again, a movie that is structurally almost a checklist of Filipino rom com conventions: the campus courtship, the tearful confession shouted across the quad, the kitchen confrontation between the rivals, the delayed love letter, and yet somehow manages to deploy nearly every one of those familiar tropes with just enough irony and self awareness to still land as devastating. So, let's talk about how a film this openly formulaic manages to still feel like it's pulling the rug out from under its own genre. Quick heads up before we dive in, this is a full spoiler dissection, ending included. So, anything that I say here, you will be able to see in the movie yourself. Go ahead and watch it as well so that you can catch all the nuances that I didn't get to. Anyway, in brief, the film follows Jenny, an architecture student played by Toni Gonzaga, and Marco, her history professor played by Piolo Pascual, who fall into a whirlwind 5 year relationship before Jenny rejects his marriage proposal to pursue graduate studies abroad, fearing she'll repeat her own parents' failed long distance marriage. Years later, the two are reunited through a professional restoration project, and Jenny begins to hope this second chance might just undo her earlier decision, only to discover that Marco has moved on with a new partner, and that very project, bringing them back together, was actually commissioned for his engagement to someone else entirely. The first act does a great deal of work establishing Ginny and Marco's courtship through imagery that's deliberately, almost campily theatrical. Ginny shouting her feelings across campus, an awkward student teacher dynamic that the film treats with knowing humor rather than discomfort, and a relationship built as much on spectacle as on substance. That theatricality is a meaningful choice rather than simply broad comedy. The film is signaling early and clearly that this is a heightened, performed version of romance, not a documentary style one, inviting the audience to recognize the genre's conventions being invoked even as it plays them fairly straight. The two professions assigned to the leads also do quiet symbolic work. Marco teaches history and Ginny studies architecture, both disciplines fundamentally oriented toward preserving and interpreting the past, which makes their eventual reunion, staged around the literal restoration of an old building, feel less like coincidence than extended metaphor. Restoring a structure and restoring a relationship are treated visually and narratively as the same act in and of itself. It's also worth pausing briefly here on that student teacher dynamic, since a modern audience, particularly one outside the Philippines, may reasonably read it as more troubling than the film itself seems to register. Some context is useful here. At the time that this film was made, the Philippine educational system had not yet implemented the additional junior and senior high school years introduced by later reforms, meaning students typically graduated high school between roughly 14 and 16 years old and finished a 4 year college degree somewhere between 19 and 21, placing Ginny at approximately 20. It was also fairly common practice, and in some ways still is, for Filipino universities to hire their own recent graduates as junior instructors shortly after completing a 1 to 2 year master's degree, which would place someone in Marco's position at roughly 22 or 23. That context doesn't erase the dynamic so much as complicate it. For the record, this isn't a wide generational gap so much as a comparatively narrow one, closer to upperclassmen and newly minted graduate assistant than the more alarming picture the professor and student framing might initially suggest to an international viewer. Even accounting for that context, Though the power imbalance inherent in any teacher student pairing doesn't fully disappear just because the age gap is smaller than it first appears, and the film's choice to treat that dynamic as charming rather than interrogate it at all is worth naming as a limitation, even if it's a fairly common one across the genre. With that said, that first act also introduces one of the film's more clever updates to an old device. Marco writes Ginny a message after their breakup and schedules it to arrive years later using an online delayed delivery service, a modern retooling of the unsent letter convention that appears across the genre in various forms. Rather than a physical letter discovered by chance, the confession arrives on a precise, pre programmed timeline, which gives the film's inciting reunion a slightly uncanny, almost faded quality, even though its mechanism is entirely mundane and technological. This is a small but telling detail about how contemporary Filipino romantic cinema has continued adapting its oldest narrative tools, communication technology standing in for the letters, scarves, and the chance encounters of earlier romantic storytelling. The second act is where the film's ironic self awareness becomes most pointed. Ginny accepts the restoration project the moment that she learns that Marco is, in fact, involved, reading the reunion as confirmation that fate is intervening on her behalf. And the film lets the audience sit in dramatic irony for a considerable stretch, since we understand well before Ginny does that Marco's real motive for the project is an engagement, not a reconciliation. That gap between what the protagonist believes and what the audience can already see is the engine of the entire second act, and it's a notably unflattering position for the film to place its lead in. Ginny isn't framed as a blameless romantic waiting for fate to correct an old mistake. She's framed with real narrative honesty as someone pursuing a relationship that has already moved on without her, which complicates the audience's sympathy in a way that the genre doesn't always allow its protagonists to risk. This is where the film introduces its most pointed subversion of a very familiar trope, the other woman archetype, embodied here by Patty, that is played by Isa Calzado, Marco's current partner, where the genre typically renders this figure as either a shallow obstacle or an outright villain, existing mainly to be defeated so the true couple can reunite. Starting over again grants Patty genuine composure, intelligence, and narrative dignity throughout. The film's most celebrated scene, a confrontation between Ginny and Patty staged in a kitchen, deliberately withholds the theatrics the setup seems to promise. Rather than an outburst, Patty responds with calm, articulate self-possession, describing her relationship with Marco as one built on steady trust rather than grand, dramatic passion, and framing that steadiness as its own legitimate form of love rather than a lesser consolation prize. This is a direct challenge to one of the genre's most persistent assumptions, that intense whirlwind romance is inherently more valid than quieter, more settled affection, and the film lets that challenge stand largely unanswered rather than resolving it in favor of the version of love its plot initially seemed to be rooting for. The third act delivers the film's central emotional reckoning, in which Marco tells Ginny with real tenderness rather than cruelty that he could never stop loving her entirely, but that his love for her has ultimately changed shape, and that it's Patty he needs now. That distinction between loving someone and needing to build a life with them is the film's clearest thesis, articulated plainly rather than through metaphor once the story has earned the right to speak that directly. It's a quietly mature statement for a mainstream romantic film to make, refusing the genre's usual assumption that lingering love automatically entitles a person to reunion. Ginny's own arc completes here as well, as she recognizes with some discomfort that her pursuit of Marco has cast her in the very role she likely never imagined for herself, and that her own well-being requires letting go rather than persisting. Then comes the film's final ironic gesture. Rather than closing on Ginny alone with her grief or on any reunion with Marco, the film introduces a new romantic prospect in its closing moments, a small, understated exchange that gestures toward Ginny's own next chapter rather than resolving her old one. Given the film's insistently on the nose title, this closing beat lands as the story's sharpest piece of irony. Starting over again was never actually promising the restoration of Ginny and Marco's relationship, despite spending 2 acts encouraging the audience to hope for exactly that. It was describing all along Ginny's own capacity to begin again with someone new, a twist that only becomes legible in retrospect once the title's literal meaning finally lines up with the plot rather than with audience expectation. Culturally, the film occupies a particularly interesting position within the Filipino rom-com arc, in part because of how directly it converses with the genre's dominant conventions. Its structural fingerprints, the kitchen confrontation, the professional project that forces old lovers back together, the mediation on maturity earned through separation, echo devices found throughout mainstream Filipino romantic cinema of the same era. One More Chance, prominent among them, starting over again, can be read as something close to a response to that broader tradition, borrowing its most recognizable beats while arriving at a considerably less comforting conclusion than the genre typically permits. That willingness to invoke the formula so precisely and still withhold its expected payoff marks the film as a meaningful complication of house style, and it helped reinforce a broader shift in mainstream Filipino romantic cinema toward endings that reward growth and clear eyed honesty over simple wish fulfillment. And that's it. Starting Over Again is available in full, completely free on Star Cinema's official YouTube channel. I will try to link it down below, so go watch it, sit with that ending, and see if you agree with what it's actually saying about second chances. Filipino romantic cinema deserves so much more international attention than it gets, and every watch genuinely helps make that happen. As always, thank you so much for watching. You are awesome, stay awesome, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!